Aubrey, you believe that aging is the world's most important problem. Can you tell us why you believe this?
All right. Yeah, I'll do that. And because I like you so much, I won't make too much fun of your spectacularly pretentious introduction.
It's going to be a long night. All right. Let's go, Aubrey.
Right. Well, I mean, to me, there's obviously only one way to measure the question of whether problem X is more serious than problem Y. And that is in terms of the amount of suffering that is caused by the problem. Weighted, I guess, by the question of whether the problem or to the extent to which the problem is amenable to alleviation by feasible, foreseeable human endeavor. So I think that for me, the fundamental reason why aging is the world's most important problem is the combination of those two things. First of all, that it unequivocally causes far more suffering than anything else that we have to experience these days. And second of all, that contrary to the impression that most of humanity has forced themselves into, it is indeed a problem which is potentially amenable to technological intervention, specifically medical intervention. That's all it is for me.
So why has the elimination of aging become so personally important to you?
So it became personally important to me in my mid-20s, so 30 or so years ago, when I became aware of the utterly horrifying fact that most people don't get it. Most people have made their peace with aging to such a profound extent that they have genuinely convinced themselves that it is some kind of blessing in disguise, and or that it's so utterly, wound into the fabric of the universe that there is not even in principle anything that we could ever do about it, therefore there's no point in thinking about it. I only became aware of this relatively late in life, in my mid-20s, because I had never asked people the question. I had never even remotely considered the possibility that anyone could not think this. So I had never talked about it to anybody. And it was only kind of by accident, after meeting and marrying a biologist, someone who was actually already a fairly senior biologist, 19 years older than me, that I, after a couple of years, began to vaguely realize that we were never talking about aging. And then when I started asking questions, discovering that she just wasn't interested in aging. She didn't think it was very important. And that neither did any of the other biologists that I was meeting. It was, a complete blindside to me. I had no idea of this until that moment. And it took another couple of years before I really came to terms with that discovery, fully enough to realize that this left me no choice, that even though I was already working on a very important problem, namely the problem of artificial intelligence, the solution that artificial intelligence gives to the problem of work, nevertheless, this was obviously a much more important problem, and it was a problem in which I felt I had some chance of at least making some kind of contribution, and here I am.
Now, I want to problematize this word aging, because I'm interested in your definition of aging, because you're very careful to say that you're not working on longevity, and this is not about immortality. Sorry to disappoint our audience, but this is not about immortality. It's about something more nuanced, isn't it?
I think that the only reason this question constantly comes up is because of the media. Fact is, the compulsion that so many people, that most people have, to put aging out of their minds, ultimately manifests itself as a need to maintain some kind of emotional distance from the question of whether we can do anything about aging. So they kind of want to know, and that's why it's always in the media. But they don't want to take it too seriously, or they'll get terribly invested in it. And they'll worry about how soon it's going to happen and whether it's going to be in time for them and all that. So the kind of trivialization that comes from using words like immortality that kind of separate this from the language that we would normally use about technologically feasible things, that terminology sells papers, and that's why it's used all the time. But it absolutely does do huge damage, because at the end of the day, we do need people to be emotionally invested in this in order to get the job done as fast as possible, because, we need people's support, we need people's money and so on, right? Yes, absolutely, I have to go to a huge amount of trouble to say, listen, for fuck's sake, boys and girls, we are not talking about longevity at all here, let alone immortality. Longevity will be a side effect of health. Yes, it'll be a very welcome side effect, but the fact is the main focus is on stopping people from getting sick. And the reason that is not the focus that appears in the media, at the end of the day, is because it's not very interesting. We all kind of already know that we prefer to be healthy rather than sick, and that we prefer everybody else to be healthy rather than sick, and you don't sell papers that way. So it's all about refocusing people from what they're told.
Do you see this? I mean, you're often lumped in with the transhumanist community who see living longer as a human enhancement. Do you see what you're doing as a form of human enhancement? And if so, do you see it as a selective enhancement, or do you see it as a therapeutic enhancement? In other words, will we choose to live longer, or will this become something akin to a universal basic right to live longer?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of make the first step in answering your own question by the use of the phrase therapeutic enhancement, because really the fundamental answer to your question is that there is a very blurry line between the two things, between therapies and enhancements. And I certainly view this all as therapy. I view it as axiomatic, really, that the restoration to old people of a state that resembles how they were before and how younger people typically are is kind of by definition a therapy and not an enhancement. However, as you say, it's kind of blurry. Whether it's a right or not, to me, is a different question, an unrelated question, well, an only tangentially related question. I believe absolutely that health is a human right, and the reason I believe that is simply because I see that it matters to people. I think that if we have any kind of objective manner in which to evaluate what is and is not a human right, then the answer must fundamentally reside in what matters to people. And people's health does matter to absolutely everybody.
Well, let's talk about some of the methodologies on our way to defeat biological aging. So you have this foundation called the SENS Foundation, and you have a particular set of things on your roadmap for SENS. Could you share with us what those 7 things are?
Yep, sure. So when I first arrived in this field, of course, I had to spend a few years really getting up to speed, learning all the, what was known, what was not known, what was uncertain. And I was always looking out for some kind of overarching framework. And to be honest, I was a little disconcerted that this framework didn't already exist, had not already been constructed. It was only during that period that I began to understand how gerontology, the study of the biology of aging, was suffering from the fact that it didn't have such a framework. Essentially, what that left it in was a situation where it was dominated by basic scientists, people who really are good at understanding and finding out how nature is, what the nature of nature, but who are absolutely awful at figuring out how to manipulate nature, how to do technology. And I'm, fundamentally a technologist. That's what I'm good at. I'm good at figuring out solutions. The difference of mindset between those two kinds of people is far larger than most people appreciate. You just use data, you use evidence in a completely different way. So, yeah, I came in and I decided, well, we need a framework. We need some kind of way to break down the problem into sub-problems and so on and so forth. And in the year 2000, when I realized that comprehensive damage repair, which was an idea that had never been considered within gerontology, would actually fly, the only reason I was able to do that at all was because immediately, literally that night when I started thinking about it, I saw how to fit together a bunch of strategies that I knew about that seemed to be realistic approaches to doing exactly this. Now, those strategies were mostly unknown to gerontologists because insofar as the groundwork had been laid, it had been laid by scientific communities outside of gerontology. In one big case, even outside of medicine. So, it was a big deal. But yes, I can certainly do that. So in the end, I came down to 7 major categories. And these categories are categories of damage. So what do I mean by damage? I mean changes that the body inflicts upon itself throughout life as consequences, inherent, absolutely unavoidable consequences of its normal operation, and which are progressive. They accumulate. And the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of those kinds of changes, but eventually the body, is overwhelmed. The changes exceed what the body is set up to handle, and that's when we get sick and eventually die. So those 7 things are very concrete concepts like loss of cells dying and not being automatically replaced by division of other cells. Having too many cells because they're dividing when they're not supposed to, that's basically cancer. Having too many cells because they're not dying when they are supposed to, which is something that people often overlook, but it's very important in, for example, the aging of the immune system. Then things that happen inside cells, the accumulation of waste products, which also happens outside cells. That's another category, a separate category. You may wonder how I decide what's one category and what's 2. The fundamental basis for that is the therapies. The purpose of the classification, of the taxonomy, is to identify with each category a generic therapy, which may differ in the details for individual examples within the category, but the overall theme will be the same. So, for example, with cell loss, it's basically just stem cell therapy. We put cells into the body that we have pre-programmed into a state where they know what to do, to divide and differentiate, to replace the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And of course, different tissues need different stem cell therapies, but all stem cell therapies have a great deal in common. It's the same across the board.